This is Dr. Coach K, and today we're going to talk about the power of the person from within. This is the studies on the textbook, The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison, from Dr. Jeffrey Reiman and Dr. Paul Leighton. We're going to also discuss the textbook of Coaching, Evoking Excellence in Others by Dr. James Flaherty. And then we're going to also talk in regards to the textbook of The Prosperous Soul by Dr. Cindy Trimm. And I will do some coaching out of the topic of the solutions and recommendations. And I am going to represent myself, Dr. Coach K. So let's begin this podcast, The Game Changer. This is the curriculum coming out of The Game Changer, which is directed and created by The Game, is acronym for the Global Awareness Management Education System. So let's begin on page 32. The tax cuts, and I'm reading out of The Rich Get Richer. The tax cuts enacted by President George W. Bush had much the same effect because 25% of the benefits went to those with incomes in the top 1%. And nearly 50% of the benefits went to those with incomes in the top 10%, using data from the Congressional Budget Office. The Nonpartisan Center on Budget and Policy Priorities noted that between 1979 and 2001, the average after-tax income of the top 1% of households rose by a stunning of $409,000, or 139%. After adjusting for inflation, this dwarfed the 6,300, or 17%. Average income among the middle fifth of the population over this 22-year period, the $1,100 or 8% increase among the bottom fifth of the population. Furthermore, as the unemployment has gone up and down over the past decades, the unemployment at the bottom of society remains strikingly worse than the national average. For example, over the past 45 years, Black unemployment has remained slightly more than twice the rate of white unemployment. In 1967, when 3.4% of white workers were unemployed, 7.4% of Black workers were jobless. By 2011, 8% of white workers were unemployed compared to 16.7% of Blacks. Among those in the crime-prone ages of 16 to 19, 12% of white youngsters and 46.5%, almost one of every two of Black youngsters was jobless. So if we think about 46.5% of the Black youth, we're talking about only 40 million total. And so 40% of the Black youth, when the youth is probably half of the Black populations of the 40 million. So you take that and divide it by half, is 20 million. And then 50% of that 20 million is 10 million children, are Black children, that is jobless. Okay, so let's move on. After place in which poverty and equality are in evidence in America is in the distribution of wealth, that is, the value of people's totals, assets minus the debt that they have accumulated over their lifetimes. Edward Wolff writes that the equalizing trends of the 1930s through 1970s reversed sharply in the 1980s. The gap between the haves and have-nots is greater now than at any time since 1929. The sharp increase in inequality since the late 1970s has made wealth distribution in the United States more unequal than in what used to be perceived as the class-ridden societies of Northwest Europe. Okay, so we're going to take a break for the data from Dr. Reiman and Leighton. We're in chapter 1. There's only 4 chapters in this book. So let's talk a little bit about these data numbers. So as we see that in the scholars, or the 1% in the scholar world of scientists, they agree with the statistics of Black everyday scholars that talk about the Black affairs and Black prioritization in the U.S., how we are having this challenge of obstacles and barriers of culture clashing, where when we were integrated into the United States, we was integrated as, once again, we got to know where we come from. At the time, we came in a legal institutionalized system that did chattel slavery to our ancestors. And this is why we have to continue to keep saying we did not come into the United States as sovereignty. Even if we had created a war and fought for our rights, we still did not come into this society as what we call sovereign citizens. We were sovereign in our country, but was human trafficked as babies, as children. So we were kidnapped, stolen, and prisoners of war. So when we go look in that history as human trafficked people, we're talking about not individually one here and one there. We're talking about human trafficking as part of a nation. So they human traffic millions, of people. If you look at the first recorded group of children from 0 to 18, it was by the thousands, and then it became by the millions. So now you have a nation of trafficked population, human trafficked population. And these human trafficked populations, if you want to look at the entertainment industry, you can use the X-Men for the sake of entertainment or education with entertainment, as you call it, edutainment, and review it as the X-Men being recruited. They were not recruited. They were not requested of. They were human trafficked. They weren't immigration. They weren't fleeing from their country due to oppression, due to sacrifice. They were human trafficked by children. If you look at our 21st century, you think about what is human trafficked. Human traffic is when you steal children. You get in, you take a child against their will, and then you strip them from their communities. This is on a large commercial level. And this is how we built the Americas, the Western world, is with human trafficked populations that turned into what I call the slave nation. No, they cannot call them Americans because they were not brought here as sovereign by choice, by election, or by recruitment. They came here by human trafficked. So it's called a slave nation. So when I say slave nation, you understand I'm talking about a population that was human trafficked into a system to be one of the cattle, one of the horses, one of the properties that will work their whole lives against their will from birth to death. Okay? So when Leighton and Reiman is talking about rich get richer and poor get prison, they're talking about the population that was trafficked to the United States because it has never been corrected. What I mean by corrected is that when the Emancipation Proclamation of the Independence Day of Black people, they were released like a prison system. They were released out of this system And then they were forced again into integration with nothing. At least in Monopoly game, you get the equal of all the players to start the game. Well, they didn't do that for the black populations. When they got released, they didn't get equal like a chessboard game or a checkers game. They didn't get the equity of what was normalcy, social normalcy. And then when they were given, in some states, what we call some type of form of equity, they had no legal protection, no law enforcement protection, no system to protect them from casualties, no insurance company to protect them, their life, their assets, or their what we call systematic livelihood. And so they lived generation and generation like this until the civil rights movement, because the Civil War really just made it concrete that slavery wasn't an option. And then the civil rights movement was basically say, okay, you gotta be humanity, or this is narcissist, or this is anti-socialism, or anti-social ethics. There was no, what we call no ethics, no integrity in killing, stripping, and dismantling black populations from their wealth or their progress or their ability to be equitable or equality or surpass what some would say, because you have the wealthy that was dominated by European Americans and Europeans, and then you had Africans that was not given the authority to surpass in wealth as become a competitor, and they were killed or they were stripped through fire, burning, accidents. So we had this culture clashing where the Native Americans sat in a third realm of sovereignty and had their own struggle and cultural clashing with European Americans and Europeans in the Americas. So now we have a small population that's integrated into households of marriage or interracial relationships that were sincere and genuine. But then the systematic level, we didn't have any clarity with Native American sovereignty. And then now here we go, a slave nation that's not children anymore. They're now adults having children, setting up their own bloodlines now as not Ghanaians or not Nigerians, not any location they were in. They were no longer these countries' sovereign citizens. They were now a slave nation without citizenship until they were given disenfranchisement or fragmented citizenship. Because you got to see, they were given fragmented citizenship based on they didn't have their own cities, they didn't have their own states, they didn't have their own prisons, they didn't have their own anything. They were still a people that was disassembled and once again fragmented in the United States. So when we call this word citizenship, they were still disenfranchised because they didn't have a sovereignty. Still, to call protection or a covering, who was the covering? Was the European Americans the covering? Was the Native Americans the covering? Was the Chinese or the Asians the covering? Every continent was represented in the United States, and they had a covering of sovereignty, except for the African Americans, which was trafficked as children into the United States to be molded, shaped, and inbred into what they were called Stockholm Syndrome type of relationship with their masters, or Stockholm Syndrome with their predators. So now they're no longer seen as predators. Now they have befriended and built a relationship that grew from power structure to superior over inferior, but yet never yet became equal. Even with the ones that were sincerely equal, they still had power structure. They were doomed to the lifetime of still serving or living a level of servitude. Now, the question is, did European Americans serve the black communities equal as they did with white communities? See, that's been the mystery. Have white Europeans or European Americans and Europeans equally serve the African communities and the African American communities as the slave nation of systematic processes to produce a competitive platform that will give them a sense of equability or egalitarian society? And that's where we get this prison complex now that has shown its fruits from the harvest. So what's been sown over the years has produced this system called the prison complex. So no, they did not serve the African Americans or the slave nation equitable to what has been given to this country, because the prison complex would have never been born. There would never have been a 50% of black youth jobless. And so 80% of blacks in prison carrying the weight of the economy through the prison system, through the military system. Okay. They've been locked out of the employment system because now the awareness has increased to know that that is a way to equability. So they've been blocked out of that system. And now the two systems to serve the country again, where you lose your rights. Okay. In the military, you lose your rights and become property. And in prison, you go into prison, you lose your rights and become property. So you have now two systems that's been built, and 90% of the black population carries the weight of the United States through the prison system and the military system. Whereas slavery was the employment system, but they had done it for free and never was paid for it. And now the system has shifted, released the blacks, locked up the employment system, made it impossible for blacks to be a part of it, where it was basically you do it for free or you get out. And we pay everybody around the world but you. And so now they go and live through military system and the prison system, which they still get crumbs under the table, because with the military system, they have no obligation to pay you competitive wages. And you still is identified as property and not sovereignty. So to break down these systems, you see blacks progress from being safe. It means to be servitude and to be what we call modest. And if there is some type of glamorous life, it's all in debt, locked up in debts. There's very few who has ownership of their assets. So if you look at the statistics, there is 0% of black populations that own any lands, any ownership of land. And then the tax exemption is not possible for Black populations, because then they cannot take your property away when your taxes are not being paid. So you have banks not offering any assets or any loans to Blacks because they don't want them to have land ownership. You don't have any employers offering job opportunities because they don't want them to have power or what we call authority over the political direction of the United States. But one thing about the power of God, and that's where I'm going to move into the coaching and the prosperous soul, the power of God starts to adapt in the situation. And because of the rejection and because of the pressure that the power of God goes through in the soul, it starts to transform and mutate and metamorphosis. And this is where we see the phenomena happens in the Black populations that's called the slave nation. We see them becoming social influencers by just showing up. Their presence on video, on audio, anywhere they go, they have this energy that transitions people's character or transforms people's characters. Sometimes I think Martin Luther King Jr. said in Strength to Love, his book that had reflections, they win souls. They win people's hearts. They win people's minds. So now no longer they are struggling and wrestling with souls. They have mastered the psychology and physiology of souls. So now they have identified themselves as fishers of men. So now they win souls. And because they've transformed, their identity, their persona is not interested in the equitability of humanity or the physical world. It's superficial now to them. Now, because they've been transformed and elevated because of the pressure of prisons, the pressure of military servitude, and because of the long blood lineage memory, muscle memory of being human trafficked from their blood lineage, they're now elevated and transcended into social beings that is interested in the assets of souls and the souls of winning souls, winning their desire. And now we're seeing the level of spiritual warfare, because now it's an asset world of souls as a commodity, not as property. Now we're talking about the level of celestial kingdom where they win souls. And when you think about Christianity, they talk about Christ having a ransom the souls, because each kingdom in the celestial kingdom have authority over souls they have won through the prosperity of what they have gained in character. So you have good and evil of decision making through winning of souls. So now when a Black person comes into a room, their bodies is transcended or elevated to win souls. They're not focused anymore on winning money like a lottery ticket, winning assets like land, because now they know life and death comes everywhere. So now they have to transcend their life daily, because life and death is not stable. Only their character is stable. So now you have the prosecution of their character through the pressure and the provocation, like provoking of their bottom line, and that's their peace. And we'll talk about that as we grow in the adaptation of each bloodline and what they gain from their decision making. So let's dive into the recommendation of coaching. We're going to read out of the Coaching, Evoking Excellence in Others, and James Flaherty. And we are still in chapter 1. We're on page 25. So let's begin. Imagine a piano teacher demonstrating an intricate fingering pattern in the air to an eager, experienced student. The student can observe the patterns and progressions and perhaps even hear the music because she is a speaker of musical language. A non-speaker of musical language might observe the same finger movements and see them as imaginary keys being struck on a typewriter and try to figure out what words are being spelled, or as an unusual, complicated way to dry nails wet with polish. Upon reflection, it seems impossible to escape the conclusion that we observe in and only because of language, provide new language plus the chance of practice to have the language become part of us, and new observations, new actions, and new world will inevitably follow. That's the importance of language to coaching. Two other aspects of language are essential for coaching. First is that language allows us to design our own world. Yes, it is a fact that each of us is born as a particular historical moment into a particular culture and family. At the same time, it is possible for us to not only bring a different meaning to the circumstances into which we were born, but also to bring about a different set of activities, relationships, and outcomes by our capacity to skillfully deal with language. This is the key to dealing with a sense of powerlessness in both personal and political realms. For example, probably the best way to coach someone is in a mood of resentment is to teach him how to make effective requests. A corollary is that in language, we can establish a public identity that may be different from the one that accrues to us from historic circumstances, probably something more cogently than their contemporaries were able to influence the future course of their discipline, even though historic circumstances did not give them a prestigious place in their society. This is Walt Whitman and Emily Dixon and James Joyce references. Observation of language forms the basis of observation, and it is, in fact, not possible to make any observations outside of language. If the purpose of coaching is to change behavior, then the coaching's mission is to find what affects behavior in a way that will bring about desired change. Figure 1.3 shows that behavior follows from the structure of interpretation of the client. This means that the way we see the world at a particular moment determines the actions we take. This is such an obvious point that many times it is invisible to us. We walk into a building that we recognize as a restaurant, and we immediately do the series of routine actions that we consider to be consistent with being in the restaurant. We discern whether to seat ourselves or wait to be seated. We look for someone to give our food order to, and so on. We wouldn't take any of these actions if the same structure appeared to us to be a hardware store, a ballet studio, a gymnasium, a gym, or a tennis court. My point is that it is not only the physical surroundings that lead us to take the actions that we do, it's also the meaning that we bring to those surroundings. So this is very powerful that we talked about these systems and how we were born into these systems. Some of us chose these systems to be a part of our lives. So when we're talking about coaching, winning souls, or elevating ourselves from the assets of superficial things like physical things, financial things of land and materialism, we start to delve into character winning, soul winning, as Christians would say, and believers of Christ winning. So now we're talking about language and observation. How would we observe or map out our environment before we choose the language, which we call in African language or African American language as code switching, to how to adapt to the environment to get the best results, which is send a message, communication that is interpersonal, that will get the soul either to show favor or the attempt to the potential of favor to win over the soul. And some people do not do it with sincerity. Some people do it with technique. And this is where you have different types of character or persona. And one thing we have seen because of Black Americans having the muscle memory of so many struggles and obstacles that their energy permeates, or what I call generates this chemistry, this chemical. The Asian scholar that established the double swing communication, I think it's Yoshia, he talks about the chemistry, the muscle memory of language, nonverbal language, that goes before you and communicates your needs before you can speak a language. And that's where observation comes in. Now, if you have your senses removed, your 5 senses, 10 senses removed, then you don't have that opportunity to observe your environment, and then what I call position yourself, whether in nonverbal language or verbal language. And this is where coaching someone, mentoring someone, teaching someone, training someone, and managing someone to do so is a disconnect, because each person comes with their own perspective, their own set of lens. We call it the viewpoint or the eagle eye, right? So now you go into these systems, because a lot of these environments are no longer naturally born. A lot of these environments are systematic, institutionalized, right? They have been put into a theoretical framework with infrastructures to manage people, to manage the ecosystems, to manage the resources, to manage the content, to manage or censor. We call it controlled environments, right? Whether extreme or lightly, you still have some level of controlled environment or autonomy environment or governmental environment. We call institutionalized, or as I said before, systematic. And because of that, you have only a personal space, and that's the space that's given to you coming into this world, and that personal space going out of this world. And we call that the God made autonomy. So that God made autonomy is the soul, which we call the the landmass of cosmos, the landmass of the spirit, right? So you have two identifications, two citizenships, and that's the citizenship that you were born into, that you take with you going out. You brought it into this world and you take it out with you when you depart of this world, right? Some of us acknowledge that we have astral projection, which you come and go all day, every day, right? You have many deaths and many resurrections, right? And then that is a whole nother topic for spiritual people. But for the what we call the internationality or the intercosmic person that has both one foot on earth and one foot in the universe, we know that's a new creature. But at the same time, let's take this apart so that we can reassemble and deassemble. So if you think about it, when you come into this world as a embryo and grow into a human being, this process is just one from a cosmic level. Because when you leave at the end of the life, you either take this body with you or you don't. And many of us don't take this body with us. So you come in this world without a body and you leave this world without a body. Okay? But it has been prophesied that some of us will leave with this body. Some of us will not in the future. So that's prophetic, right? Because we have learned how to have autonomy of this body. We've mastered it. We've learned how to become one with it. Okay? And that's another study for another day. So back to these systems, the celestial system and the human system. But they both have systematic. Now, if you want to look at it, there's a third system, and that's planetary, which the Earth system is very quiet. It has a system, though. It's light-footed, but it is a system. See, human system is heavy-footed, and then the celestial system is invisible, meaning it's a silent partner system to the Earth and to the human and all the species, trillions of species on this planet and beyond. So when you talk about systems, we go back to the prison system that manifested from the human trafficking system of chattel slavery. You get this evolution of system of oppression to the black people. So what this got to do with the world in general? Well, if you look at it, the whole Western world was built from the hands of, I call it human trafficked children. So once again, the prison system was built on that same ideology on children. We just read 50% of children are jobless. They will be sent to prison. Black children will be sent to prison, or they will be sent to the military. And now they're starting to make it harder for black children to be in the military because that's power again. They've learned how to be self-defenders as well as world defenders. So now they're getting locked out of military, and now they're going towards the prison pipeline, which now we have a school to prison pipeline that has been identified in mass incarceration against black children. And in fact, black boys being targeted as a target audience, a target market, right? So why is this important? Well, let's keep moving through, and I'll let you guys keep that as a mystery, a riddle. So the last part, we're going to finish up this podcast with the conversation of the prosperous soul by Dr. Cindy Trimm. And we're still in the first chapter, working through it. And we're almost at the second chapter. We're on page 42. And so let's begin. Hold on. I want to make sure I got my pages right because sometimes I get my pages twisted up. Okay, so yes. So here we go. I'm going to read the sentence before this page so I can make sense of the new conversation. So she talks about he could hone his skills and explore the last and greatest frontier, which is not outer space, but inner space. He could develop a better work ethic. He could become an industry-specific thought leader. He could express wisdom and become a difference maker as a problem solver. He could become a better team player. He could patch up his leaky character, mature spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, and socially so that he could handle hardships and challenges, thus becoming a man God could entrust with great responsibility and authority without it crushing him. In short, what he did was prosper his soul. Prosperity point. Do you want God to be able to trust you with more? What specific steps are you willing to take to see permanent change in your life? Do you want to be more prosperous socially, professionally, and financially? Do you want a healthier body, a healthier mind, a healthier spirit? Success can certainly happen overnight, but if it did, would it destroy you or propel you to be the next level? Oddly enough, the answer to all of these questions is rather simple. Even though it can be far from easy, the answer is locked up in 3 John 2, chapter 2. You will prosper and be in health in proportion to how you prosper your soul. Prosperity thought. Each of us guards a gate of change that can only be opened from the inside. Marilyn Ferguson. So Dr. Trimm talks about what I just talked about, which confirms what I have said. In order for Black populations, any populations for that matter, but because we're identifying the rich get richer and poor get prison, the conversation about the game changer is how to turn, like the phoenix, how to rise above your ashes, turn your struggle into prosperity, turn your defeats into prosperity. And this could be a recipe for success for anyone. But as we know, not everyone is going through prison life, oppression life, depression life, martyrdom, getting killed, being innocent. So this is what we're talking about, is how to raise the belly of the beast. They were saying Jonah with the well, when he went into the well and sat for 3 days and came out and spoke to a nation and got them to be transformed and was able to miss their death wish, their death appointment, right? Some of us believe in things that in life we can be a game changer, a champion. And even Dr. Trimm was saying, what can we do when everything is taken from us? If you look at the monks in the martial arts, their discipline is a fit body, a sound mind, quiet life, still life, and a life of modesty and materialism. But they're very rich because they have elevated their soul into a prosperous soul. And we can see that with witch medicine people, Santerians, or you call it the witch doctors. They elevated themselves, lived modest life, focused on their disciplines, mastered their crafts into understanding the tree and how it heals, and transformed it to the highest level, surpassed pharmaceutical and advanced medicine, because they've made their soul into a prosperous soul, because they've taken that autonomy level and elevated to a supernatural level. which is called mastery, or taking their talent and made room for them. So now when they walk in a room like Daniel did, that was called Bethashar, he was able to prophesy, see the future, calculate the present, mathematical system like algorithms beyond his years. You know, he was a human computer prophesying people's fates and their decision making. Because there's probable, you only get two decisions in life, positive or negative, forward or backward, right? Two directions. You can't do too much with math. You know, you could do extraordinary things with math, but at the end of the day, you only can subtract and add, right? Right. So this is the conclusion to this recommendation and coaching session and a chat journal in regards to the prison and what people have set up in controlled environments. So here you are, you have a world system that says you can own the whole world and yet lose your soul. Or you can lose the whole world or have it taken from you and gain your soul. This is exactly this conversation is talking about. You can become a phoenix and rise out of your ashes. And that becoming the phoenix is the prosperous soul. It's the assets. It's the equability. It's the egalitarian system is when you become the phoenix. Now, some of us will not choose that path. Some of us will choose the path of gaining the whole world to be equal, to be equitable, to be a power structure in the world, even if it isn't the head of that 1%, it will be a population in that 1%. And this is not no condemnation conversation. It's an awareness conversation that we all, natural selection, chooses the entity we become. Infinite entity. What type of infinite entity? A lot of people believe that an entity that is gained the whole world and lost their soul is one community, and the one that has been given their soul but everything else taken away from them is another community. And then here's a third community rising up as a new community that is of both. They have gained the whole world and gained their soul. And this is what we're calling the New Jerusalem, or the entity of Christ, because they're a new creature. They have found favor with creation and they have found favor with God. And so this is where the coaching begins, is rising up these type of teams that has conquered or gained the whole world and did not lose their soul, but transformed their soul into what we know as the prosperous soul, because they did it first, right? When they were in the rock bottom, they became a prosperous soul. They transformed into a phoenix. And then they were able to rise up in power and rise up in wealth and rise up in the world. And then they built and created new worlds. And now they no longer have gained a worldly system. They have created a worldly system. This is Dr. Coach K signing off. Thank you.